Kruglanski as our inaugural speaker for our new virtual series, the Motivated Cognition Meetings. Dr. Kruglanski is a distinguished professor of psychology at the University of Maryland. His lab, the Motivated Cognition Lab, focuses on human motivation as it affects thinking, feeling, and behavior. Across his extremely prolific career, he has published more than 400 articles, chapters, and books, and has been cited more than 50,000 times. He's received funding from a variety of sources, including the National Institutes of Health and Mental Health, and the Department of Homeland Security and the Ford Foundation. He's also the recipient of many, many awards, including the National Institute of Mental Health Research Scientist Award and the Donald Campbell Award for Outstanding Contributions to Social Psychology. Today, his talk is titled My Life at the Motivation-Cognition Interface, A Tale of Two Journeys. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kruglanski.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much, Colleen. And hello, motivational scientists, wherever you are. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on the time zone. I'm really very happy and proud to inaugurate this series of virtual talks on motivational topics, another great idea from our beloved SSM. Now, you know, when Alexandra and Sebastian kindly invited me to give this talk on the interface of motivation and cognition, I felt greatly honored, of course, but also a bit nervous about what should I speak about. There are so many aspects of the problem that are interesting. The mental representation of motivational concepts, goals and means, goal activations through priming, how motivation affects beliefs. Are we aware of our true motivation, and so on. In short, there's a whole lot out there that motivational scientists uncovered and that I could talk about. And the choice seems so difficult that I thought I better escape it altogether. Instead, with your kind permission, I'd like to indulge in a bit of nostalgic retrospection and share with you the history of our lab's journey through the twists and turns of two separate research programs in the motivation cognition space. The first concerns people's motivation toward uncertainty, facing the unknown, and the second, the psychology of means and relations. Way back in the 1980s, I was very interested in the issue of uncertainty in the context of knowledge formation. In essence, knowledge formation is the opposite of uncertainty. It's the banishment of uncertainty. And to me, the big question, the million-dollar question was, how do people do it? How do they decide to stop gathering information? How many replications does it take for us to feel that enough is enough and that we are justified in forming confident knowledge on an issue? What, in other words, is the stopping mechanism of information gathering? The problem is that there is no objective sign that tells you where to stop. And in fact, as you know, some people keep obsessively gathering information way beyond what other people would see as reasonable. So if there is no objective stopping rule, such rule must be subjective. And we proposed along these lines that this mechanism is motivational, and we called it the need for cognitive closure. The need for cognitive closure is the need for certainty. When it arises, our brain does what it takes to reach certainty. Essentially, it gives us a feeling of certainty and a sense that no further gathering of information is necessary. But of course, reaching closure does not mean that the knowledge that we formed is correct. we could be wrong. And sometimes, very often, we are. But if we are wrong, we have the capacity to unfreeze our beliefs and change them until we arrive, if not at the truth, at least at beliefs that work for us, however temporarily, which is what truth is anyway, according to the pragmatist philosophers like William James, Charles Peirce, or John Dewey. The need for cognitive closure represents an escape from uncertainty through seizing and freezing on information that affords closure. This notion of closure seeking and uncertainty avoidance is very much in line with the general assumption in the field that uncertainty is aversive and that in general people fear the unknown. Along these lines, for example, as early as 1948, Elsa Frankel-Brunswick made famous the concept of intolerance of ambiguity. Many years later, Gert Hofstede made equally widely known the idea of uncertainty avoidance. There exist several important theories about how self-confidence, low self-confidence or self-uncertainty feels uncomfortable and threatening, and how people defend themselves against it. Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman, in their storied work on judgment under uncertainty, emphasized people's quick escape from uncertainty through the use of these judgmental shortcuts, simple rules of thumb they called judgmental heuristics. And earlier on, Wendell Garner, in his classic book that was entitled Uncertainty and Structure as Psychological Construct, that I enthusiastically read as an undergraduate at the University of Toronto in the lab called the Ebbinghaus Empire, Garner stated that people in any situation will seek for meaningful relations between the variables, and if no such relation exists or can be perceived, considerable discomfort occurs. But is it actually true? Are people so invariably averse to uncertainty and drawn to certainty? Perhaps not. I was struck by people's diverse responses to uncertainty during the COVID-19 pandemic. Whereas some people were devastated by the pandemic and view it as a threat, others considered it as a challenge. They strove to find the silver lining in it, following Rahm Emanuel's advice to not let any crisis go to waste. The master chef, Jose Andras, for example, used this opportunity to feed free of charge thousands of hungry people during the pandemic, adding to his stature as a great humanitarian, for which he was nominated for the Nobel Prize. Indeed, several research paradigms attest that people often approach rather than avoid uncertain situations. Studies on sensation-seeking, risk-taking, exploration, curiosity, hope, surprise, challenge suggest that some of the people, some of the time, actually seek out uncertain situations and are excited by the sense of mystery and adventure. Research on hope, surprise, gift-giving also highlighted people's positive feelings to novel, uncertain situations. Scientists and artists exemplify this excitement to approach the unknown. In this vein, Albert Einstein quipped, "If we knew what we're doing, it would not be called research." And Andrew Wiles, the celebrated Oxford mathematician, credited with proving Fermat's last theorem, famously remarked, "Pure mathematicians just love unsolved problems. They love a challenge." So perhaps fear of the unknown is not a general response. It follows that uncertainty as such is neither necessarily bad or experience as aversive, nor necessarily good or experience as pleasant or exciting. Rather, the effect we feel toward an uncertain situation is determined by the negative or positive thoughts that the uncertain situation happens to bring to mind. An uncertain situation is like a Rorschach inkblot on which people project their demons or the better angels of their soul. But how do the positive or negative thoughts arise? Genetics plays a part, of course, but genetics do not tell the whole story. One's personal history also counts. In fact, we found support for a model that identifies two historical factors that affect one's reactions to uncertainty. One of them is a long-term history of outcomes, and the second is short-term history of outcomes. So, for example, here in this case, we administered a scale that studies perception of one's parents during childhood. Basically, the scale measures the extent to which you had a good childhood, you were taken care of by your parents, you were loved, you had a secure attachment, and so on and so forth. And we find that this is related to optimism, which is related to negatively related to intolerance of uncertainty, and that is in fact intolerance of uncertainty is related to effective reaction to uncertain events. So if you're intolerant of uncertainty, you react negatively to such events as a blind date, the first day out of school, the birth of a new sibling, a job interview, a pop quiz, game of bingo, a swim of an ocean, a terrorist attack, and so on and so forth. We also find that adverse childhood experience do the same in reverse. Adverse childhood experience are related negatively to optimism, positively, this is a wrong sign, positively to intolerance of uncertainty, and intolerance of uncertainty is again related negatively to positive affect to uncertain events. So long-term experiences affect how you react to current uncertainties, and this is mediated by optimism and your intolerance of uncertainty in general. Now, does that mean that we are forever doomed by our childhood? It turns out that we are not. Our recent experience have an important impact as well. Research suggests that when something good happens to you, you tend to be optimistic about the next thing, that it will also be good. For instance, if you beat your partner in tennis, you'd feel more optimistic that the meeting with your boss will also go well. If one of your papers was accepted for publication, you feel more optimistic than the next one will be accepted as well. And of course, the opposite is also true. When something bad happens to you, you become pessimistic about the next thing down the pike as well. In the domain of judgment and decision-making, recent experiments by Ido Erev and his colleagues had participants choose between different options with unknown payoffs. In other words, they were making decisions under uncertainty, and they received feedback, positive or negative. And what he finds is that participants overestimated the likelihood of positive feedback on the next trial if they received feedback on the 5 previous trials. And if they received a negative feedback, they overestimated the likelihood of a negative feedback. Erev and colleagues found interestingly that their participants disregarded the probabilities of wins and losses that they learned from all their previous trials. That is, they disregarded their long-term history of outcomes. And instead, they based their predictions of the next trial on the immediate past 5 outcomes, which is, of course, reminiscent of the Higgins-Bargen-Lombardi 1985 famous work on the synapse model. They found that until the activation of a recently primed category decays below a threshold, it dominates participant responses, whereas the frequently primed category, which is analogous to long-term history of outcomes, determines the response after the impact of the recently primed category wore off. Federico Contu and Antonio Piero recently extrapolated this logic to reactions to uncertain situation. They had participants first respond to a 14-item past perceptions measure that tapped their history of long-term outcomes. Some items on the scale, more good things and bad things have happened to me in the past. In my life, everything has always worked out. In my life, I've had more good things than bad things, and so on and so forth. So that was the long history of outcomes. The short-term history of outcomes was they responded to a knowledge questionnaire and they received positive or negative feedback. And then they responded to an uncertain situation, having to stay in a place where you've never been before. And they did it either immediately after receiving the short-term outcomes, the recent outcomes, or 2 days later. And what they find is that the short-term outcomes had an effect immediately thereafter. The solid line is the short delay, and the long-term outcomes is the long delay. So the short-term outcomes had effect under the short delay, but not under the long delay. And the long-term outcomes measured by this questionnaire had an effect 2 days later, but not immediately after the short-term outcomes. By the way, these ideas about circumstances under which people escape or embrace uncertainties as they are determined by history of outcomes are described in my new book, Uncertain, which is just hot off the press. So our interest in people's reactions to uncertainty has been a constant. The work on the need for cognitive closure focused on the consequences of escaping uncertainty, while the more recent work focused on the antecedents of people's reaction to uncertainty. And it highlights the idea that in and of itself, uncertainty is not necessarily aversive or threatening. Rather, it's like a blank screen on which we project our anxieties and our hopes, our pessimism and our optimism. And particularly interesting in this context is the possibility highlighted by recent work in positive psychology by people like Marty Seligman, Carol Dweck, or Angela Duckworth, that optimism, growth mindset, and grit can be learned, and therefore that people's responses to uncertainty can be modified. And subsequent research should examine this possibility. Now, the work on reactions to uncertainty has a close bearing on something in which we, social and personality psychologists, have been interested for decades, namely the issue of cognitive consistency. And the question at hand is whether cognitive consistency is aversive. Please note that uncertainty is the epistemic consequence of inconsistency. If some trusted source tells you that X is the case, while another source tells you that not X is the case, you are confused and uncertain. Which is it? Is it X or is it not X? So if uncertainty as such is not necessarily aversive or disturbing, as we just concluded, cognitive consistency should not be either. But wait a minute, have we not been told forever that people have a fundamental need for consistency and that cognitive consistency introduces tension and upset? How is it possible then the inconsistency as such is effectively neutral and can be either pleasant or unpleasant? To solve this enigma, remember first that Leon Festinger himself qualified the notion that inconsistency as such is tension-inducing when he noted that the inconsistent cognitions at stake must be important to the person. In other words, inconsistency among unimportant cognitions should not introduce distress, or at least should introduce less distress. But this clause about importance of cognition does not solve the problem, does not tell the whole story. To see things more clearly, it is helpful to distinguish between the epistemic and motivational consequences of inconsistency. Any inconsistency whatsoever produces uncertainty. This is the epistemic effect of inconsistency. But this doesn't tell you yet whether the reaction to the uncertainty will be positive or negative, or how positive or negative it would be. The answer to this question depends on the motivational response to the inconsistency, which in turn depends on the desirability or undesirability of the outcomes involved. If the inconsistent cognitions undermine a belief in a positive state of affairs, you feel bad. This is the case of an unpleasant surprise. But if the inconsistent cognitions undermine a belief in a negative state of affairs, for example, they undermine your belief that you suffer from an incurable illness, you feel good. This is the case of a pleasant surprise. And as Barbara Meller's research suggests, people's effective reactions to positive surprises is very positive indeed. So can inconsistency be pleasant? Yes, it can, just as uncertainty can. So why is it the case that hundreds of dissonance studies, if not thousands, the world over, support the hypothesis that cognitive inconsistency introduces distress and tension, which in turn causes attitude change? Because of a major and persistent confound, specifically a vast preponderance of such studies, dissonance studies, addresses the case of not just inconsistency, but inconsistency combined with a negative state of affairs. Most of these studies conveyed to participants bad news or exposed them to a negative surprise, which understandably elicits tension, distress, and negative affect, not because of the inconsistency, but because of the negativity. For instance, in classic forced compliance research, one's desired self-concept as a reasonable, principled person is undermined by evidence that one has committed a counter-attitudinal act for insufficient inducement. This elicits negative affect, which is reducible via attitude change that restores one positive self-regard. Other dissonance research suggests, for example, that for attitudinally inconsistent behavior to elicit negative affect, it must be performed under free choice, the Linder, Cooper, and Jones study, implying individuals' personal responsibility for negative behavior, again impugning one desirable view of oneself, negative surprise. In the decision context, the positive qualities of the rejected alternative and the negative qualities of the chosen alternative are inconsistent with your desired knowledge that you made a good choice, and so on down the pike. In this connection, too, people whose general response to uncertainty is negative, that is, people who are high on the need for cognitive closure, should react negatively to any inconsistency. And research by Daniela Di Santo found exactly that. So, as you can see, the negative effect on the y-axis, the solid line is high, both with respect to inconsistent positive outcome and inconsistent negative outcome. Whereas people who are low on the need for closure, they do not react negatively to positive outcome, but they react negatively only to inconsistent negative outcome. In summary, what began years ago as a search for a stopping mechanism of information gathering ended up illuminating responses to uncertainty as such and casting a new light on the cognitive consistency paradigm in social psychology. Indeed, considering the role of motivation and cognition turned up a few surprises and qualified some widely accepted assumptions to which we all had faithfully adhered to. No less surprising has been our lab's second journey, centered on the distinction between means and ends. The origin of this trip dates back to the 1980s, the early days of attribution theory, that is mid-70s actually, and in particular to the popular distinction at that time between internal and external causation of behavior. This distinction suggests that some of our behaviors are caused by internal motivations that come from within ourselves, and other behaviors are caused by external motivations that originate in the environment. But the very idea of an external motivation seemed wrong to begin with, for the concept of motivation as such implies by definition an internal force, something that we want to accomplish, secure an outcome that we desire. On this view, there is no such thing as an external motivation. All motivations are internal by their very definition. They emanate from our needs that are part and parcel of our human nature. Take a prototypical example of the so-called external motivation, a case in which a robber confronts you with your money or your life dilemma, and you choose to yield your wallet in order to survive. A moment reflections reflects that here too, the motivation was your survival instinct, a fundamentally internal need, if there ever was one. So what differs between the case where you do something that you do not want to do, like give away your wallet, and the case where you do something that you want to do, say, watching TV or having an ice cream sundae? In a 1975 paper in the Psych Review, I suggested that the critical distinction here is between means and ends. The means is something you do not really want to do. You do it only because it serves an end, which is something that you do want to accomplish. Giving away your wallet is a means. It's not something that you want to do, but it serves an end you desire to attain, saving your life. So the real distinction isn't between external and internal motivation, but between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, in which extrinsically motivated activity is a means to some further end, whereas an intrinsically motivated activity is an end in itself. The distinction between ends and means has an important implication. Means are substitutable, whereas ends are not. It's always possible, in principle, to devise an alternative means to a given goal, that is, to substitute one's means for another. This principle of substitutability is actually a cardinal principle of behavior change. You cannot change being hungry, but you may change the ways of satisfying your hunger. If your favorite restaurant is closed, you can go to a different restaurant, cook at home, or mooch of your friends, etc. In our research on radicalization and terrorism, we have seen time and time again how committed jihadists or neo-Nazis made an about-face and became leading figures in the fight against the far right or against the jihadi movement, all in the service of the same underlying motivation, the quest for significance and mattering. Thinking about goals and means and the relationships led to the development of, by my colleagues and I, of goal systems theory that recently celebrated its 20th birthday. This theory has a structural aspect that differently configured relations between goals and means, equal finality, multi-finality, counter-finality, and an allocation aspect pertaining to the distribution of attentional resources across different regions of the goal system. Because of its breadth, goal systems theory was applied by researchers in different labs to a variety of real-life problems. One of these, of special relevance to these times of overdrive we live in, has to do with psychology of extremism and is based on the multifinality constraint effect of goal systems theory. The MFE has to do with the principle that the more active goals you have, the fewer the multi-final means that can be found. Each additional goal puts constraints on the multi-final means. So the more constraints there are, the fewer are the means that can meet all these constraints. Consider, for example, the goal of getting a car. If getting a car is all that matters, there are numerous possible cars, small and large, old and new, fast and slow, different colors. But if the car must be an Italian sports car, red in color, very fast and slick looking, the set of such cars is much smaller for all the constraints that the goals exercise. So the set of means to a goal depends on how many other active goals there are. If there are many other goals, the set of means is small. If there are no other goals, the set of means is large. Now, extremism happens in a situation of a motivational imbalance where one goal becomes so dominant in terms of its saliency and its magnitude that it withdraws attentional resources from all the other goals. In such a situation, the multi-final case, where you had many goals, is effectively transformed into a unifinal case. Consequently, constraints that the other goals exercise on means to the focal goal are removed, and the set of means to the focal goal is increased. In the absence of those constraints, anything goes, and behaviors that previously were unacceptable, terrorism and other extreme events, are now permitted because their constraints are removed. And as we have shown, this core dynamic underlines a variety of extremism that were not previously discussed together, including violent extremism, in which people are willing to kill and die for a cause, extreme diets, in which people are ready to sacrifice their health for the sake of a svelte figure, workaholism, where they are willing to sacrifice their family, their interpersonal relations on altar of their career, as well as a variety of addictions to substances, to gaming, to sex, etc. Finally, in 2018, over 4 decades after publication of the original means-ends paper in 1975, we have come a full circle back to the topic of intrinsic motivation that we interpreted now within the framework of goal systems theory as a means-ends fusion. According to this conception, there's a continuum of motivation intrinsicality as function of the degree to which a given means is perceived as indistinguishable, fused with its goal. And we identified a number of variables that determine the degree of fusion. Means uniqueness to the goal, temporal proximity between means and end, covariation between means and end, and by now this means and fusion and the various conditions that produce fusion has been supported by a variety of studies by Ayelet, Fischbach, Kathleen Woolley, and others. So what have I learned from our 2 journeys? You inquire curiously. One thing I learned is that research is a journey with no definite destination. Publishing a paper on a topic isn't necessarily the end, not even the beginning of an end, although it could be an end of the beginning, to borrow a phrase from Winston Churchill. Theories and findings are kind of temporary equilibria, whether at the time you might think that this is it, that you completely exhausted the topic, that it's time to move on. Sometime in the future, perhaps a decade later, it can come to haunt you again. You might get a fresh insight into it in light of new findings and new ideas, and you might unfreeze your previous conclusions and revise your thinking about the phenomenon. Now, admittedly, this unfreezing of deeply entrenched ideas can be tough on your and your friends' nerves. Yet this unfreezing business would have been much harder and much more anxiety-evoking if it weren't confronted collaboratively with colleagues and students who are willing to go with the flow, suspend disbelief, embrace the uncertainty, and take a leap into uncharted territories. So it has been truly my honor and my great privilege to work with so many amazing people without whom my scientific journeys would have been much less fun, much more onerous, and much less fruitful. To them, therefore, go my greatest and deepest thanks and gratitude. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kruglanski, for this fascinating summary of your research and your research program. I'm happy to see that we have some minutes of discussion left. As far as I can tell, there's no questions in the Q&A yet, but if you have any questions that you would like to type in there, you can do so. And otherwise, as Alexandra Freund already did, you can also just type in question into the chat, and then we will call on you and you can ask your question in person. So I'm handing over to Alexandra Freund.
Yeah, thank you very much, Arie. There was a great tour de force through a long research career, very, very impressive. I would like to link the two parts a little bit. So I was wondering if you think of uncertainty more as a means of sort of getting at questions and sort of setting the scene in order to think in a new way about problems. So you need a little bit of uncertainty, you need to tolerate it. Or is getting rid of uncertainty very much in line with the research that you've tried to debunk in a way? Is it an end state that people try to avoid? So maybe the people who really dislike uncertainty, for them it's an end state that they try to avoid, and for those who love it, who seek it out, most of us as researchers do, it's a means to get at certain issues. Do you link those two areas, or am I totally off?
No, you're not. You're right on target. It's very interesting. I never thought of it this way, but now that you think about it, it's true. People who hate uncertainty view it as a negative state of affairs, negative goal that they would like to avoid. People who embrace uncertainty see it as something that affords possibility to satisfy their goals, something that has affordances, in which one can discover new means to one's goals, along the lines of not letting a crisis go to waste. So I think it's a very useful and important insight that you have, that an uncertainty, if you approach it, if you embrace it, is a possibility to uncover new means to your goals, to satisfaction of your needs.
Okay, there are further questions. I will try to call upon them chronologically. So in the Q&A, there's a question by Alan Wickfield, who asks, you talked about the need to reduce uncertainty. Why do you term it a need?
I called it the need for cognitive closure. It's a motivation. You can call it a motivation for cognitive closure. When we talk about needs, goals, motivations, sometimes there is a confusion. I basically believe that there are several basic needs that people have. I mean, I'm not the only one. Maslow, Higgins, Fisk, DC, and Ryan, they all assume that there are some basic needs, and everything else emanates from those basic needs. So I called it the need for cognitive closure. I do not mean to imply that it is one of those basic needs, although this whole issue of basic needs is very much left unsolved because people disagree. People agree that there are basic needs, but people disagree of what these basic needs are. So Susan Fiske has the bucket of 5 needs. Tori Higgins has 3 needs. DC and Ryan have 3 needs. Maslow had a bunch of needs. It reminds me of this great instinct controversy, how many instincts there are. You know, Freud talked about instincts, McDougall talked about instinct. Finally, there were 3,400 instincts that people identified. So I just feel that the need for closure is a motivation that has antecedents, it has consequences. I would not insist that it's a basic need because this whole issue of basic needs is still something, a challenge that requires resolution.
And then there's another question in the chat by Steven Sloman, who asked, is there a relation between means and fusion and making decisions based on sacred values versus consequentialism?
Sacred values are, to me, means as well. They're not an end. I think, you know, I've had this discussion with Scott Atran, who talks about sacred values. The need that sacred values fulfill, in my opinion, is the need for significance and dignity. If you serve a sacred value, you are doing something that your community appreciates, and therefore you become significant. You matter. You are a good person. That's the importance of sacred value. So sacred values, to me, is a means to attaining significance. Other values, the values that Scott Atran talks about, sacred values, are usually moral values, but there are other values that make you significant, such as in a materialistic society, wealth. For example, Donald Trump never stops boasting of how rich he is, and he feels that this gives him stature, status, and significance. There are many different values, you know, in some societies, physical beauty gives you significance. So sacred values are just one type of values, and all values are means to gaining this significance, this mattering, this sense of social worth.
And there's another question by Daniel Rossman, following up on the previous question on needs, which is, do you have any advice or suggestions on how we might go about resolving the mess of what the basic needs are, or what are the next important theories of needs? Yeah, what might these theories include?
I think that it's a really important question that needs to be resolved because everything else is clear. Once you know what these basic needs are, there's a hierarchy. Those needs are served by goals. Those needs presumably are hardwired in people in general. They're part of human nature. And the goals are culturally determined. So that's, you know, the goals different between different cultures, different society. Different cultures have different values, and they, you know, serve the same set of needs is served differently by different goals that are culturally determined and so forth. If we only knew what those basic needs are, how can we resolve it? Well, you know, maybe the way the personality psychologists talked about the big five personality dimension. Maybe we need to factor analyze all the scales, all the different need scales that people have produced, and come to an agreement on the basic factors. But right now there is a confusion. Everybody has their own set of needs, and that's detrimental to progress, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. There's another question by Sarah Marshall, who asks, if you ever cross paths with the idea of cognitive dissonance, how do you feel about this concept?
Of what?
Cognitive dissonance.
Oh, cognitive dissonance. Yes, I've crossed many paths with this concept. We have a paper in the Psychological Inquiry 2020 that discusses it at length. As I said, the cognitive dissonance leaves things unresolved, and it confounds the idea of need for consistency with the consequences, the motivational consequences of the inconsistency that vary. Festinger hinted at the idea of importance, but it's not just importance, because importance suggests how disturbing would a given inconsistency be. The idea is, however, that not only that it can be less or more upsetting, less or more aversive, it can be downright pleasant. It can be downright positive, pleasant surprises. So I think the distinction between what cognitively inconsistency does, which introduces a confusion and uncertainty, and how you feel about uncertainty, which has to do with the motivational outcomes, is very important to make. Not any confusion you care about. You may not know what the weather is going to be tomorrow, but maybe you don't care about it so much. And there are pleasant surprises. So I think the dissonance theory made great contributions, but we must move on. We must understand the gaps that it left and try to develop the ideas further.
Okay, there's another question by Ruth Koosters on the flexibility of goal systems, and I will unmute you so you can ask the question yourself.
Yes, so thank you, Arie, for a great talk. Perhaps not surprisingly, I have a question about goal-means relations and goal systems theory. And your work has been the basis of the work I'm still doing on that. So thanks for all your thoughts and indeed the model you shared with us. So I was wondering what you have to say about the flexibility of these systems, because pursuing one goal in a certain context can perhaps be done by different means than pursuing the same goal in a different context. And I was wondering, how do people shift between different representations, if you assume that these are associations between means and goals? So how does that work cognitively? And do you agree that indeed these systems are fairly flexible and situated?
Yes, very much so. I think goals are very flexible, and within that system that I was outlining, there is a set of basic needs that all people have, and then there are goals that are determined by culture, by historical period, by context, whatever seems to given your knowledge about the context, what seems to work. So you may have a given need, say hunger, and your goal is to go to a restaurant, and then you see that the restaurant is closed. So you develop a goal of getting some grocery and cooking your own meal. So it based on the information you get, you flexibly change your goals. But I think the basic idea I have is that all of these goals ultimately are means at different levels that serve this basic set of needs. And this basic set, one need that I've been really very interested recently has been this need for importance and dignity, because I feel that this need is really moving the world around, creating wars, creating revolutions, creating social movements, because people feel that their dignity has been compromised, and so on and so forth. So I think this would be one thing that I see as a universal need, but there are other needs, of course, physiological needs. And then the goals are flexibly adjusted, both informed by culture, how do you do things are, constrained by culture, but also by context, whether a given culturally accepted goal is appropriate, can be attained in a given situation based on what you know about the situation. So I think it's all very flexible other than the set of basic needs. The basic needs is, you know, the rigid, fixed aspect of the human nature, and everything else is very flexible.
Okay, there's another question in the Q&A by Yasmin Brummer. I'm just going to read it. And so she asked whether performance feedback could also lead to compensatory response strategies, such as focusing on gains after receiving losses or loss-related feedback. And if yes, what factors might play a role for these compensatory responses?
Well, compensatory response sounds very much like a substitution. If one means does not work, you compensate by another means. So I think it's very much an aspect of the nature of means that they can be substituted. If you suffer a setback by using of one means, by trying one way of attaining your goal, you turn to another way. That's part of the flexibility that Ruth talked about. I think that compensation is analogous to substitution, and it is really a very important principle of behavior change, that if something doesn't work, you change your behavior in order to satisfy the goal in alternative ways.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one final question, if there's anyone left. And if not, I think we are perfectly on time. On my behalf, I would like to thank you very much, Dr. Kruglanski, for this wonderful summary of your incredible research program, and for kicking off also this lecture series in a wonderful way. I'm not quite sure if there's anything left to say at this point.
I just want to say it's been a pleasure and an honor, and it was really a great idea, and thanks so much for being here. And I'm really very, very happy for you to have organized this event. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.